I mean, it would be interesting to know from your point of view who is driving the sustainability agenda at the moment. Is it the client? Is it the government? Is it you as architects?
Well, we have a responsibility naturally to ensure that we are providing that early advice to a client, whoever that may be. As a practice, in the early 1990s, we did an office scheme and had got a Green Award, one of the first available at the time. But that was very much on the basis of using renewable materials. And again, dropping back to energy use, it wasn't using sustainable materials. It then sort of fell by the wayside very slightly, and it wasn't until one of our bigger clients, the University of Cambridge, they were being forced by the government to have their buildings accredited through the BREEAM process, and therefore as a result of that, that's when it started to trickle through as a greater level of importance. But naturally that is often led by budget, it's often led by programme, to a lesser extent to where the building is actually going to be positioned, its location, because there are certain elements within BREEAM that you go through almost a tick box arrangement. But sadly, there is this constant shifting of sands in terms of procurement, in terms of availability, in terms of cost. I think everybody has a willingness to accept and adopt a sustainable approach to however they build. But once it actually gets through the planning process, detailed design, and then costed, that's when thought needs to be given. The dirty word value engineering comes out, which is, do we look to make savings in certain areas? And regrettably, the cost of certain materials will be prohibitive, will prevent that from going through. Unless you've got a client that is very hard fast in wanting to achieve the various levels that they were committed to begin with. We developed, and many architects have, and I'm sure as well, Adam, you've got something similar, a matrix, whether you want to go for a standard, innovative, pioneering, or something beyond that. And that very quickly gives an indication of the level in which we as designers pitch in with any design. Unfortunately, there's no cost associated with that at that particular stage. That doesn't happen until it goes through the sort of early budget estimates. But again, it's not truly reflective.
No. The majority of our clients are house builders, developers, or sort of, city centre, mixed use regeneration type projects. And I have had conversations with a number of clients who have, started out at being as we are not being innovators, we are not pushing the boundaries. Their priority is cost. And increasingly it's hard to argue against that. There was a time where maybe you could have maybe massage it a little bit more, but there wasn't an interest in it because it didn't bring the value added. And I think now, and increasingly going forward, that's where we have to try and persuade them, the ones who aren't buying, building and keeping their stock, who are selling it on and then can just walk away, to actually persuade them that actually it's worth it. People will pay for it now, and hopefully the cost difference will get smaller, like it has done for PVs. Housing associations who are building for their, for the long term, developers who are going to keep their buildings and run them. Need to keep finding people to rent their office space or whatever. They will be interested and they will be pushing for it because it's a really positive selling point. Although it's definitely shifting.
Sometimes it's I wouldn't say it's hard to convince, but there has to be good justification. Using the registered landlord analogy. Years ago, trying to convince them to shift from a UPVC window to a timber window. But they were saying, well, it's maintenance-free UPVC. Well, actually, it's not. If you carefully detail design, the profiles relating to the timber window, actually what you're talking about is something that's going to be far better for the planet, and your maintenance strategy isn't going to be so bad. I think as a result of the climate change that's now so very evident, we're experiencing now going through heat warnings that are coming out in the news at the moment. when it comes to considering how we're constructing a home, a dwelling, we need to consider that it has to be able to prevent that heat build up within the building. It can't be done just by insulation alone. It has to be done by thermal mass. Once upon a time it was a case of timber frame. That's the way to go because it's erected very, very quickly, and we can introduce the insulation. Actually, it's better to have some thermal mass there because in terms of internal environment it's far better. As a result of that, you're then not relying on any way of cooling, whether it's passive or artificial in some way. There are clients that are starting to awaken to that, which is good. But regrettably, it's all about hard and fast cash. It's about getting something churned out as quickly as possible. And our role within that design process sometimes falls upon deaf ears, sadly.
I think of late, the only shift I would say to that has been fire safety.
Yes.
You know, obviously, since Grenfell, there's been an absolute, paradigm shift across the industry in terms of the importance of that, which has actually been really helpful. Everybody is now working to the same kind of agenda. They all understand why it's important. They're not trying to cut corners. None of that going on now. That really helps. I fear the climate emergency is a much more slow burn. Sorry about that pun, but it's people are not going to grasp that problem, and I think the challenge for us as architects really is to not be weighed down by that. It can be terribly depressing. And we don't want that. It can be an optimistic way of looking at how we develop and how we design, how we build things. How do we just understand what's actually happening and work with it in a positive way?
The climate is such a broad stroke discussion point, whereas with fire, you're saying with fire, it's a very specific answer to a very specific question. When we come to climate and so on, it's such a broad stroke discussion point across all construction that trying to get the engagement to make that change is going to be one of the hardest. We've all got to get to the same spot on the road, so to speak, to say, well, this is the most important thing to us all now. And it's going to be differing for different sectors within the market, from your side, from your customer and client base, from our side, which is the supplier base. It's all going to be at different levels. And until we get aligned and get across the line together, you're not going to have that collective discussion that says, this is the solution we need to get to, because everyone's got their differing starting points. And I think that's one of it. With more noise and the media attention and client interaction, there will be more noise towards this, and as we get closer and closer and further away from this date into the future, it will become a bigger noise. But we're not really all in the starting blocks at the same place.
Sadly, that's great if it works, if it's adopted that way, but sadly, invariably, it's not until our arms are twisted, our hands are twisted and push that particular direction. Car travel is one. We're in a situation where the cost of fuel is going up, and therefore there's people using greater use of transport or purchase of EV vehicles. It's not until we start to deplete some of the resources that we realise actually we can't keep taking this out of the earth, and therefore we've got to look at different ways of being able to manufacture, whether it's block, whether it's brick, whatever it may be, in the process of developing a component within our built environment. I don't think it works where you're going to get to a point where just the moral, the principle of the thing, people are going to adopt it. Is it going to be government-led? We've seen some of that in the past with some of the accreditation systems which we spoke of earlier, BREEAM, Passive House. But before that, there used to be the planning Merton rule in terms of the percentage of renewables you're expecting to see on a development. That I wouldn't say necessarily has fallen by the wayside, but the controlling aspect of that, the constraining aspect of that has loosened somewhat in terms of the terminology. It's not until we're hit by that wall in front of us are we going to find and again, it's unfair to say clients, but it's the general public, because they are our client ultimately, wanting to make that commitment. And yes, there's an element of the generational thing that creeps into this. We didn't necessarily experience it during our tertiary education. We were fortunate with the architectural education we had an element of it. We were made aware of it. But now, obviously, there is an insurgence that's coming through where they are acutely aware of it. And I think it's gone through general education. You know, I can remember my two coming back from their school saying about recycle, reuse, the 3 R's, and I'm going, oh, I've not heard of this bit before. So it's good. It's encouraging that's happening, and therefore, as a consequence, hopefully there will be the leading light. I'm not saying it needs to be another generation that sorts it out. It is all of our problem. We're all responsible for this, and I think as architects, as manufacturers, you're doing your bit. It's the take-up that's needed by others when it goes through the supply chain.
Yeah.
It's one of those, if you take the EV analogy, you had rising costs, you've got legislation telling us we ought to be not using petrol, but then they gave us the incentive, the carrot that says if you buy an EV vehicle, you'll get subsidised, because we know it's more expensive than a standard car. That part hasn't come into this. You know, there's no subsidies or no incentives for innovation to happen, because we know at the moment it sits on your side of the table that says you've got to tell your client it's now 25-30% more expensive because we're using these types of materials.
Well, I think that's the difficulty. It was always going to be sitting on the other side of the table, isn't it? Until someone actually steps up to the line and goes, right, we need to do this. And all of us need to go, right, we do need to do this. We need to make that change rather than being forced down a particular avenue.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting though, because you're talking about, you know, renewable energy and that need to provide more, you know, on site rather than I mean, the GLA are actually probably one governing body that is pushing that agenda, and you know they make demands sort of on buildings that are way beyond you know, nationwide sort of planning requirements, but they can afford to do it. You know, it comes back to cost again. You know, in London, values are at a level where you can put 35% more energy, you know, on site if you need to get the planning permission. You know, if you're looking in Manchester, the costs of actually, or the values of what you build are a third of, you know, what they are in London. You know, so how can you afford to do that? There isn't that big a difference in build costs. No. You know, supply materials between Manchester and London. It's that land value. So, you know, it does come back to, you know, being pushed along that route, whether it's incentives, you know, to buy through, you know, feedback tariffs with PV sales originally. Cost of PVs has come right down now, and that's actually not necessary. Electric vehicles, the same thing has happened. You know, that shift has happened, and at some point it will, that change will happen. But the reality is we've still got to deal with all our existing stock.
Very good. I had a meeting with a client yesterday, lives in a Victorian villa in the centre of Cambridge, and we were talking about looking at going a sustainable route. Well, where do you start with a house? They're doing it in a and very good. They're doing it in a piecemeal fashion. They're looking at their windows first, but then of course there are constraints relating it to being conservation area. So therefore you've got to consider the design and what's available to them. But if you're looking, and we're going to energy use here, but if we're looking to go for an air source system, where do they put them? How do they change the operation within the central heating system within the house? So it becomes very problematic. We are relatively unique as a nation that our housing stock ranges from a 15th century cottage rectory all the way up to a 1970s previous council house.
I think we've got more than any other country in the world, I think, of old.
So therefore, how do you retrofit? But it's you know, sadly, that's not what we're talking about today. No, there's another topic of conversation, but it's still a very valid one that needs to be overcome. Yeah. And it's about insulation, and it's about ensuring, energy loss again, but we're not losing that heat through the fabric of the building, and ideally we're not overheating the building when we're experiencing temperatures that we're experiencing at the moment. And again, sort of swing it back to block work, that is very much in your favour. You've got the opportunity here to without selling your product, but you've got an opportunity here to sell a product that is carbon neutral. It can, I would suggest, in a few years' time, it can even be manufactured from a product that can carbon capture as well, and then provides something that is going to be evidently providing an environment that is going to be good to live in. I'm talking housing here, but of course that also goes back to commercial buildings as well, whether it's high rise, whether it's low rise or not.